Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. Today I want to talk to you about philosophical argumentation and how to write a philosophical essay. In this class, and in most philosophy classes, you're going to have to write thesis defense papers. In this class, those thesis defense papers are philosophical in nature, and they require you to follow a rigorous argumentative format. Now, I should preface this video by saying that all of this is for your sake, and they are guidelines. Okay, these are guidelines for things that a philosopher reading a philosophy paper written in the last 75 years or so would expect the philosopher to follow. Now, they're not hard and fast rules. They're not things that you have to, that you'll live and die by. But they are very useful tools, especially if you're new to philosophy, for writing something clearly, precisely, and rigorously. It should help you in order to following these tools on argument and writing, I think will help you um, learn the fundamentals of writing in a philosophy class or writing any sort of philosophical paper out of which further creativity can be generated. Okay. So the first thing I want to do is talk to you about arguments. Now, philosophical arguments are often very complex. They take place in a variety of ways, in a variety of formats. So what I'm talking to you about right now is a very simplified, reductivist version of what a philosophical argument looks like. But I think for a starting point, for a 100 level class, this is exactly where we need to start. We need to start looking at the logic of a philosophical argument and how that unfolds. So let's take a very basic argument in philosophy. One of the most basic forms an argument can take is a syllogism. A syllogism is an argument in which there are two premises, an inference, and a conclusion, and the conclusion follows via the inference from those two premises. So we might say, and this is a very typical example given in philosophy, premise one, all human beings are mortal. Premise two, Socrates is a human being. Inference, and then a conclusion. Therefore, Socrates is mortal, right? That is a deductive argument. That means it follows with necessity, given the truth of those two premises, that the conclusion is also true. If it's true that all humans are mortal, and it's also true that Socrates is a human, then it follows with categorical certainty, that is necessity, that Socrates is also mortal. Okay, so that's very clear, and that's very obvious, and that's very straightforward. That's a syllogism, a deductive syllogism. That's deductive means that it follows necessarily. The difference between a deductive argument and what's called an inductive argument is that deductive arguments happen with necessity, that is, the conclusion follows necessarily given true premises. An inductive argument, a good inductive argument, is one in which the conclusion follows with a strong degree of likelihood given all true premises. Right? So I might say that here's two premises. The postwoman normally comes to my house around 5 o'clock. It is about 5 o'clock. That's the second premise. Therefore, the postwoman is at my house delivering the mail. It's probably the case because most of the time she does come about 5 o'clock to deliver the mail, but it's not necessarily the case. Sometimes she's late, sometimes it's Sunday, sometimes it's a holiday. There are reasons why it might not be the case, but usually it is the case, okay? So that would be an inductive syllogistic argument versus a deductive syllogistic argument, like the one about Socrates, okay? So those are the two basic forms of simple arguments that you'll find in a philosophy class. Depending upon what you're writing about and what you're arguing for, you might be following a deductive argument, or more likely and more commonly, an inductive argument, but it could be either, okay? So, notice in both cases, we have the same components of the argument, okay? All arguments have premises, an inference, and a conclusion. The conclusion of your argument is the point that you're trying to make, right? So if any good philosopher is trying to make a serious point in the essay or book or whatever it is that they're writing, or even if they're just speaking, they're trying to make a substantial point about some philosophical truth. To do that, they need to support that with a series of evidence. Okay, that evidence is given in the premises. In a syllogism in which there's only two premises, it's very clear and apparent what that evidence is. But there could be three premises, there could be eight, there could be 500, right? Depending upon the complexity and the nature of the argument. There could be a lot of evidence that supports the inference we make to the conclusion. Okay, so three central parts of any argument. Premises, which are the reasons for the conclusion, or you might think of it as the evidence in favor of the verification of the conclusion. The inference from the premises to the conclusion, and then the conclusion, the thing you're arguing for. Right? So let's just take that in terms of the words in the sentences on Socrates, in the syllogism on Socrates. Premise 1, Socrates is a human being. Premise 2, Socrates is a Premise 1, Socrates is a human being. Premise 2, all human beings are mortal. Okay, so those are our two premises. Those are our two pieces of evidence in support of a conclusion that we're going to draw. Therefore, and therefore is our inference, something new, some new information that we're just thinking up on the basis of the information we know, Socrates must be mortal. Right, so that's another way you can see how arguments work in philosophy. We can establish new information that's not been directly observed or known before on the basis of the information we already have at hand. Right, so if we already know that all men are mortal, all human beings are mortal, if we already know that Socrates is a human being, then we don't have to see Socrates die to know that he's mortal. We can infer that he's mortal on the basis of logic, right? On the basis of a logical inference. Okay? So, when you're writing a philosophical essay, you don't have to follow a syllogistic format. You don't have to have two specific premises, and you don't have to infer your conclusion deductively from those premises. But you do get the idea that you need to have evidence that you use to support a conclusion. Right? Now, in a thesis defense paper, which the philosophical argumentative essay is a kind of, there is obviously a thesis, right? And that thesis is being defended in the thesis defense paper. So, what is being defended? The thesis. Well, what is being defended in an argument? The conclusion. So, the thesis is the conclusion of your argument. Now, that said, just because the thesis is the conclusion of your argument doesn't mean it goes in the conclusion of your essay. You should always clearly articulate your thesis in the first paragraph or two of any philosophical essay you write, at least as a general rule. I mean, there's always exceptions, and some people can get really creative and do really cool things, but as a general rule, it's good to put your thesis at the beginning of your essay, okay? So, just as an argument has parts, and those parts work together to create a good argument with a valid or sound thesis, the parts of an essay work together in order to build a well-organized, easy-to-follow argument, right? So we want to see the argument clearly articulated through a clear, precise, and well-organized paper. So in general, in any thesis defense paper, philosophy or otherwise, you'll have an introduction, you'll have a series of body paragraphs, and then you'll have a conclusion. The introduction, as the name would suggest, you introduce your subject, you say, here's what I'm talking about, here's perhaps why I think it's important to discuss this, or why it's relevant, and here's what my take on it is. Here's my thesis, right? So if you decide to talk about the nature of personal identity on the basis of the split brain cases, teletransportation, and Buddha's ideas on the not self, right? The whole Parfit's bundle theory versus the ego theory we'll see later with Descartes, or whatever it is you want to talk about, right? If you've got a view on bundle theory or ego theory or some other view, that's your contribution to the question on the nature of personal identity, right? So your personal view, which you will be arguing for, that's your thesis. That's your conclusion of your argument. So you're going to put that in the introduction of your paper. So in this example, you'll say, you know, it's important to talk about personal identity because this is something that's, very personal for all of us. It impacts how we think of ourselves, and how we think of ourselves impacts the meaning that we make in our lives and the way we interact with others. So there's all kinds of important reasons why we care about personal identity. Here's what a couple people think about personal identity. Here's what I think. Okay, so you got to get what you think in the introduction. Now, you don't yet have to say any of the reasons that you think it. You do have to give those reasons, but you're going to give those reasons in the body paragraphs of the essay. So think of each body paragraph as corresponding to one premise in a syllogism, right, or in any logical argument. In a syllogism, you have premises, and those premises lead to your conclusion. Now, in a syllogism, there are only two premises, but you can put as many premises as you need, as many pieces of information of evidence as you need in support of that conclusion. So, in your body paragraphs, think of each individual body paragraph as a main reason for the conclusion that you're drawing, for your view on the subject, right? So each paragraph, each body paragraph is the expression of one main reason, right? So you might have heard of topic sentences before. Topic sentences are the first sentence in each body paragraph. What they do, what their intention is to clearly state what the topic is of that paragraph. So just as your introduction introduces the topic of the whole paper, the topic sentences introduce the topic of the paragraph. And then within that paragraph, you provide the reason that or the premise that you're using to support your conclusion and explain how it supports your conclusion, in what way it's useful to draw the inference to the conclusion on the basis of that premise. You do that in each body paragraph. Now, there can be several different kinds of evidence, right? Different types of evidence that a person can use. Just to stick with the Parfit example, right? He uses evidence from science fiction literature. He uses evidence from scientific studies. He uses evidence from religious history, with his example of Buddha. He uses all kinds of different evidence and he uses straight up philosophical argumentation, the most important part of evidence in his paper, for the conclusion that he draws, right? So evidence can come in a lot of different forms from a lot of different sources. Let's say that you're talking on a moral question, right? Your moral question is what the value of philosophy is, might be, or what the nature of enlightenment is, right? These are, in some sense, moral questions. In a moral thesis defense paper or a thesis defense paper about an ethical subject, there are two main types of premises you can get. There's factual information, and then there's moral normative information, right? So you might say that there's this information about the way the world is or how the situation actually unfolds, and then there's this information about what we should do about it on the basis of some philosophical reasoning. In other philosophical essays, you can think about it the same kind of way. Say it's a metaphysical, you're making a metaphysical argument, or you're making an epistemological argument, right, about the nature of knowledge. You can use the same two basic types of premises. Premises about facts, about the way the world is, empirical information, we might say, and then philosophical information. That is background philosophical assumptions or philosophical arguments that lend support to your view, right? So let's say you want to make a claim about ego theory, right? You want to say ego theory is true, right? And you've got several different pieces of information you're going to draw on. You're going to draw on experiential evidence that everyone seems to report the existence of a self. That's particularly prevalent because there are now reports of how people experience the dissolution of self, so there must be a self to dissolute. I don't know, that's one potential piece of factual information, just the general report of so many people who experience the sense of self. You might also want to involve philosophical or metaphysical reasons as background for why you think ego theory is true. Maybe you believe in the existence of an immaterial soul. If you do, then you don't necessarily have to argue for the existence of an immaterial soul in the paper, right? Sometimes we use philosophical foundations to make layered philosophical arguments on top of it. It can oftentimes be too tedious in a short paper to explain every single one of your philosophical foundations. That said, it's always better to answer more why questions than not. Okay, so if if you do believe in the existence of an immaterial soul, just for example, then it's often better if you can at least briefly say why you have that belief and why you think that belief is useful to support the ego theory of self-consciousness or something. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. So there's all those different components of an argument and of a philosophical essay, and they work together, right? So the argument is kind of like the actual logical structure of the claim that you're trying to make, right? The argument is what you're doing. The argument is the stuff. And then, yeah, you can think of it that way. The argument is the stuff, and then the schema for how to write a paper, the introduction, the body paragraphs, the conclusion, all that, that is the form in which you fit the content, right? So the content's your argument, the form is the structure of the paper, you put the content in the form. And if you have good form and you have good content, that is, if you have a well organized, precise, clear, uh, intelligently written paper, and you have a good argument with strong evidence and a clear thesis or conclusion that we can infer from that evidence, if you got both those two things, then you're going to have yourself a great paper. Okay? That's all you've really got to worry about in order to write a great philosophical essay. Right? Make a good argument and clearly present that argument. Anything beyond that is just added bonus, okay? So if you don't have the most creative, beautiful um, paper ever written, don't worry about that, okay? Because that's not what's at issue here. It's awesome if you do have that, and it'll just take your, 99 out of 100 to 101 out of 100 or something. Like it'll make it. It's great to be able to add literary flair to what you're writing, but it's not strictly necessary. Okay, what we're worried about here is learning how to think critically and how to present our ideas as clearly as possible. Okay, so that about sums it up for how to write a philosophical essay and what the aspects of the philosophical argument are. I wish you luck on your midterm essay, and just let me know if you have any questions.